Rachel. And so it's often referenced in French literature. And you do know about this connection. One of the women writers that I'm currently researching was also an archaeologist / explorer who is said to have discovered, she went to Susa and found the palace that is thought to be, or was thought to be, Ahasuerus's palace. And there's a New York Times article from 1880 something that we looked at with some of my students that details how it corresponds to the rooms of the harem and all of that. So there's a connection beyond that. So I'm going to ask you a few questions to just get a sense of your process and some of the really fascinating arguments that you make here, and we'll open it up so you'll have a chance to ask your questions later. So I want to start by just asking how you came to write this book as the author of The Semantic Field of Cutting Tools in Biblical Hebrew. If you could just take us from the past, from that. Which I wish I'd been able to have a dialogue with you about that, because I'm sure that would have been just... I know. I can't even imagine. As the chair of languages.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, in all seriousness. But how did you get from that to writing about the Book of Esther?
So that's a good question, actually. So I think I actually don't even quote that book in this book. No, people constantly refer back to their own work, even for things that like other people have discussed better. I don't even think it's mentioned because it has nothing to do with it at all. But it's actually, I'm actually very happy about the way this book came about, because it came straight out of teaching a yeshiva college undergrad class, which I hadn't asked to teach, but the chair had asked me to teach. And in teaching about the Book of Esther, there were a few things that were put together that other people had been writing about identity politics and diaspora in the Book of Esther. And then towards the end of the semester, we were talking a little bit about early but later interpretations of the Book of Esther. And the students, of course, some of the students were familiar with some of the Talmudic statements about Esther. And so together we were reflecting on the fact that much of what I had been arguing was radical about the Book of Esther throughout much of the semester was sort of corrected in some of the early interpretations of it. And I thought that was really good, and I thought that that hadn't quite been articulated the way that it had come up in class in the literature that I had been reading. So towards the end of the semester, I wrote a very short 8-10 page paper for distribution among the class that this is, I think, what's come out of the class from my perspective. I'd like all your comments on it, see if there's thoughts about it, and then at the end of the semester we'll see. I'll do a more serious literature search and see if this is actually something for publication or if it's just sort of helpful within the class. And then after the semester, I started to work on it more seriously, and there were certain parts that needed to be expanded and some parts that needed to be fleshed out more. And I kept putting more and more things into the footnotes. And eventually, before I sent it to any colleagues, which as I'm sure you know, that's a stage in the... I know you know, but at a stage in the research and writing process is when I feel like, okay, this is pretty much as far as I can take it right now. I'm not ready to send it off to a journal, but I do want another opinion about this. And by that time it was about 45 pages. And I sent it to one colleague who said, well, this all seems very good, but you have so much in the footnotes that you say you don't want to talk about because of space constraints. Why don't you just talk about it and see where that goes? So that was actually a very liberating comment. Suddenly, like, not feeling like I had to keep things as concise as possible. Sort of like expanded it, and it turned into a book, which was it's sort of a very organic process. So, as opposed to the first book, which was not an organic process, I can't think of any organic way of coming to write about the semantic field of cutting tools. But this is a very sort of just developed and then I sent it off to publisher.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the way it works.
So that's like a new idea of a flipped classroom where the professor writes a paper at the
right,
end
exactly.
and the students comment on
That's
it.
true. It's actually very useful. it's one of the things that I'm actually very happy about with the book, because it came out of teaching undergrads. There are three, they're no longer undergrads, but three then undergrad students who are thanked in the acknowledgments because they all, they weren't in the class, but they, read drafts and helped me check things. So it was very much something that came out of teaching and related to teaching, specifically in an undergraduate school, which, so by contrast, I've never said a word about my first book. No one else would even know that it exists if it weren't in that
Now it's your
bio.
time also.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't get a lot of requests for it. Not sure why.
I'm sure it's being read.
There are much better
already.
pictures in the other book, like axes and swords, but I don't know.
These guys are going to all run to the library. So, and what part of that, was that initial writing a chapter, a few chapters, or did it get sort of spread out over the course of...
Right, so it's basically spread out. Maybe, could I take a second to sort of explain the structure of the book?
What the book is about.
Since I know it's priced that no one can afford to buy it. But the book basically goes from, it tries to situate the Book of Esther in intellectual history. So the beginning of the book tries to set up what Jews were saying about a whole series of political issues in early Second Temple times. So Neo-Babylonian and Persian period, 6th, 5th, into the 4th centuries BCE. And then claims that the Book of Esther is written as a conscious response to some of those intellectual, cultural trends. And then the second part of the book claims that as a result of, sort of a natural result of it being a challenge to some of the conventional wisdoms, sort of predictably, the early reactions to it were pretty negative. That the people who held the conventional wisdoms were not so excited about this book that was challenging conventional wisdoms, so responded to it by trying to quash it, by ignoring it, by fixing it up, by actually changing it, or by reinterpreting it. All sorts of different ways of dealing with a problematic text that you can't get rid of anymore. So that was so to the extent that there's anything new here, I mean, the literature on Esther is just massive, and probably the worst thing about biblical studies now is how much there is to read that doesn't actually contribute to one's knowledge of the text and the issues, but there's a lot written and you have to read it because it's what's there. But no one had sort of put it all together in a story that it actually spans sort of more than a millennium of intellectual history. Obviously, a narrow slice of intellectual history, but going from about 500 BCE till 600-700 CE.
Would make such a good cultures over time, by the way.
Yeah, if someone were thinking about the core, for hypothetically. So people had done parts of that, but as far as I could tell, no one had sort of told this whole long story. And I think that the details are really enriched by putting it in as part of a long story. That you saw it as a long, natural process of sort of give and take on the intellectual, cultural, political spheres, rather than just sort of like, oh, there's a detail here in intellectual history, and isn't that interesting what's going on there? That is interesting, but it's even more interesting when you see it as part of a much longer story. So,
but you're also making a particular argument about the Book of Esther, so do you want to say a few words about that?
I'm not exactly sure what you have in mind, but...
about the politics.
Yeah.
About Esther as a political text.
Right. So I guess it's sort of a weak version and a strong version of what I need to argue. The weak version is that the book could be read as a very radical book. The strong version is that that's actually what the book meant to do. So, the most famous fact about the biblical Book of Esther is that God's not mentioned in the book at all. There's just no mention of divine anything. Not in any name, not any reference, not oblique, just not there. So let me take that as a sort of an example of what I mean by a weak version and a strong version. So a weak formulation of that would be that readers might say, this could be read problematically as not talking about God, and I have to worry about that. I don't want this to sort of get out there and worry that other readers might misunderstand it as actually being a book not about God. So whether or not the author meant that, that's a potential reading, and I, as a reader, might be concerned that other people might misinterpret it or interpret it that way. And so I might be motivated to as we see some of the readers did, just sort of stick in God and say, like, it's clear that God belongs here, so I'm going to rewrite it with God involved. The strong formulation of the argument would be, no, that's exactly what the author meant to do. The author actually meant to argue that there is no God in the story. For whatever reason, he might be doing that. One other example. So Esther is intermarried. She's actually married to the Persian king. So again, a sort of weak formulation of that argument would be like, well, in this particular context, there was extenuating circumstances. It's necessary for the plot for her to be intermarried. She's intermarried. That's just what there is. But there might be a concern that some people might take that as sort of licensing assimilation to an extreme degree. The strong version of the argument would be that's exactly what the author was trying to do. The author was actually trying to set up a hero who is as assimilated as you can possibly imagine, because that's really critically important for his vision of what it means to be a diaspora Jew. So I sort of waver on which of those readings I mean, the weak or the strong. And for the purposes of the argument, I really only need the weak argument. All I have to do is really be concerned to show that people could have understood it to say all these subversive and radical things. But in fact, I actually think the strong argument is correct. I do think that the author was consciously and very methodically trying to take apart piece by piece much of what he perceived to be the sort of conventional wisdom of the day. And I guess I should say that the conventional wisdom, what I try to do is try to piece together that conventional wisdom basically from other biblical texts, from roughly the same time periods. We have a whole bunch of biblical texts from these centuries, and they all have what I think were more conventional views, aspiring or even trumpeting a return to the Jewish homeland, looking forward to the restoration of a Jewish monarchy, looking forward to the restoration or talking about the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem. Certainly a belief that Jews should be when possible, they should leave the diaspora and form their own polity, and of course God's involvement in the world. And the strong claim is that the author of Esther actually went piece by piece and said all of these things are not life as we know them. We live in diaspora. There's no obvious God here. There's no point in aspiring to an autonomous polity or a monarchy. And our heroes are as assimilated as possible, and so on. And that's actually what. So again, the strong argument is that that's actually what he was trying to do in writing the book. So yeah. I mean, that's not the usual way of reading Esther, but
right, which is I think what I understood. Correct me if I'm wrong. That you were making that strong argument, especially in your use of the device of calling the author of the text Marduka. Maybe you want to talk about that device, but as a way of talking about the history, the person that we don't really know anything about, but based on what you were able to piece together. And I also wondered if you could just also explain, how much do we know about when and where it was written? You seem to situate. I mean, how much is that in question? How much of that was an argument that you were making that was in tension with what other people might be saying about this?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I sort of didn't want to get bogged down in first trying to establish on independent grounds when it was written, because we don't have a lot of real evidence for it. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but nothing all that strong. Who the author is the book is anonymous. It says at the end of the book that the heroes of the book, Mordechai and Esther, wrote down what had just happened, but that almost clearly shows that that's not the book we're reading, because otherwise you get this really weird recursive thing where they're writing about what they're writing about, what they're writing about, what they're writing about. So, there's a sort of conventional wisdom today that Mordechai is the author of the book, but certainly that's not based on the book itself, and it's not even based on the Talmudic tradition, which doesn't claim that either. There's some, I wouldn't push it very hard. I don't know exactly. Okay. I think I learned it in my second grade class.
Oh, okay. Got
There's some evidence that, like, if I said, like, well, how do you know anything about it? I say, look, there's some evidence that it's in the Persian period. The author knows very well the geography of Shushan, of Susa, like you said. The descriptions are very, very realistic. He seems to know that there's a sort of palace precinct that's separated from the city by a river. There's one point where Mordechai crosses over, apparently, a river to get from the palace to the people. So, geographically, it's likely written by someone who knows the area, someone who's been there. The language is what's usually called late biblical Hebrew, which proves that it's not early, but that's, no one ever thought it was. So it's not all that useful. The language is interesting, actually. It's slightly different from other books of the same time, but geography explains that as well as chronology, so it's not. It doesn't help all that much in dating the book, and there's no Greek loanwords, so maybe that argues that it's before the Greeks. A book like Daniel does have some Greek loanwords, so maybe that's interesting. But there's really not anything very hard to go on in terms of dating it. I put it around the year 400, which is within a century of the events that it's describing. It's set 75 years earlier than the time that I sort of put the author. That's based basically on like sort of a rough guess. Like, it should be late enough. The first line says it was in days of Xerxes, Achashverosh. He was the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces. There was a second Xerxes who ruled in 405 or some, who ruled over a reduced Persian Empire. So, I wouldn't argue this very strongly, but that sounds like the author already knows of another Xerxes. There was some greater Xerxes that he's looking back to, but that's about as good evidence as we have. So that's not, I think your first point is actually the answer to the second point also, that the best argument I have for dating it and for situating it is that the story makes very good sense if you assume that there's a Jew who lives in diaspora around the year 400. He's reading stories of Daniel. He's reading some of the prophecies that are coming from Jerusalem, from Yehuda, and he's responding to it. So I made up this fictional character named Marduka. Marduka is actually a name that's attested in texts of the time, in Persian era texts, which is the name Mordechai in sort of Babylonian form. And I made him up for two reasons. One was it gets very tedious saying the author of Esther says, the author of Esther says, the author of Esther says. So at first I actually had sort of abbreviated that. I like an acronym, and I was like, this is ridiculous. So I just gave him a name. But the second reason to give him a name was that it enabled me to think of him as a real person and not just as the person who I really can't know anything about. All I know is that he wrote this book. Because what was explanatory about it was to be able to say, I can actually come up with something of an intellectual profile of this person. I can say something about what he's reading. I can say something about where he's living and what he thinks about where he's living. Obviously, I don't know much about him, but there's the beginnings of a portrait that I can draw, and that's not just convenience. That actually, I think, is to my mind, that's one of the most powerful ways of explaining something. Is say, like, we actually know something about this person, rather than just sort of hiding behind, like, there's a text and therefore there must have been an author. So there's a person who produced this book, and if there's a person, I should be able to figure out something about who this person was and what he knew. So there's actually, when I submitted the book to the publisher, this person, Marduka, actually had a much bigger role in my narrative. So as you might know, depending on the publishers have anonymous reviewers that they send the manuscript out to. And it went to two anonymous reviewers who are still anonymous to me, one of whom wrote a whole paragraph about how wonderful it was that there's this fictionalized author and how what a powerful tool that is for really explaining the background and the dynamics of the book. And this is a really fantastic use of sort of novelistic elements in a scholarly book. And the other reviewer used really disparaging terms about this particular element in the book, and they said that it's unprofessional, it's unacceptable, and there's no room for such writing in academic writing. So I sort of wasn't sure what to do. So the editor was like, well, you can decide. You have these 2 reviews. You can do what you want with it. So I was like, well, I don't want to make half my readers angry. So I sort of cut out much of his role, but left him in to some extent. But I have actually like a whole novel in my head about Marduka.
I was going to say, that's very interesting. Because it did feel in that sense almost like, a book that people buy at a lesser price, that it's a story, and it was a very compelling one.
Right. Yeah.
No, it was. I think you found a happy medium there. So one of the reasons why there's so much to say about Esther is that the book was really different from a lot of other sort of what we'd think of as analogous texts. And that's kind of part of what's getting worked out in all of these comparisons. On the other hand, you show all of these fascinating ways where there's these intertextual repetitions and references to other biblical texts. So you mentioned a little bit about one of the things that was different, which is that God was not present at all in the text. But can you talk a little bit more about what is so different about Esther and some of those intertextual discoveries?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I'll give two quick examples. So Marduka, I assume, is listening to, maybe reading stories about Daniel. And Daniel is a diaspora hero, a Jew who lives in diaspora, very similar sort of on the surface to Esther. You have a Jew who's exiled, lives in the eastern diaspora, even in the palace, so much like Esther. And has a foreign name like Esther. Esther is actually said to have a Hebrew name, Hadassah, and then a Persian name, Esther. And Daniel also that's a good Hebrew name, but he gets a Babylonian name. So there's a lot of similarities. But Daniel, if you read the stories of Daniel, you find a very, very obvious recurring pattern in the stories of Daniel. So Daniel keeps getting into trouble because he's a staunch, very conservative religious Jew, meaning there is no compromise that he will allow in his own practice or belief of his Jewish religion, even when it's against a clear and explicit decree of the king. So take one of the stories of Daniel. The king is sort of tricked into making a decree that no one's allowed to pray to anyone else other than the king for a certain amount of time. And Daniel essentially doesn't care and goes to his house, and at the window prays, as he always does, facing Jerusalem, to the God of Israel. In other words, he doesn't even bother to sort of take 4 steps inside so that no one can see him. Doesn't bother him at all. Doesn't matter that the king just decreed this. He's going to do what he always does. No compromises when it comes to religion. So this becomes the famous story of Daniel and the lion's den. He's tossed into the lion's den for ignoring the king's decree. But that's no problem in the sort of world of Daniel, because God will send an angel, and the angel will close the mouths of the lions, and so Daniel is fine. He escapes, and the people who set him up wind up getting thrown to the lions. So that's a really interesting story. I think it's a wonderful story. But I sort of surmise that someone like Marduka, who probably has some other name, but I'm going to call him Marduka anyway, would have heard these stories and say, well, this is actually a terrible message to tell our kids. Because if they're actually faced with a situation where there's an explicit decree of the king that if you do X or Y, you're going to get thrown into the lion's den, and you just say, well, I don't care, I'm going to do this in public anyway. No, that's not at all what you should be doing, children. You should, at least be hiding. And if you really feel like there's nowhere to hide, then maybe you should actually, not put your life in danger, not sacrifice yourself for a law or for a practice. He might have argued that if all the Jews actually insisted on sacrificing their lives for the Jewish religion, there would be a very quick end to Jewish history, and that's it, right? If everyone insists that we can't be loyal, that we can either be loyal to the sort of foreign rulers or to our religion, and if that means die, and we have to be loyal to our religion, if that means dying, then so be it. Well, that's it. I mean, that's the end of all Jews, and therefore this is a terrible way of sort of bringing up the next generation. We have to teach them to be more nuanced and more flexible, or something like that. And so he draws a hero who theoretically has a choice. She could either be taken to the palace, or theoretically, you always have a choice, right? She could die. if she insists on and says like I absolutely will not be will not intermarry, I will not go to the palace. So people often say like, well, she had no choice, but of course that's not true. You always have a choice. You could always cross your arms, stand in the doorway, and if they kill you, they kill you. So he draws a hero who no. If that's the choice, so obviously I go to the palace, and if that means violating what until now has been sort of a basic assumption of what it means to be a good Jew, quote unquote, meaning avoiding intermarriage, well then so be it. I can't die for this, because if we all die rather than be willing to be flexible, let's use a positive term, or violate the law, then we'll all die, and that'll just be the end. So that's one way in which he sort of seems to be looking at earlier texts, but painting a very different picture, sort of prescriptively, through his story than the earlier texts do. Another example, which sort of more on the political side, is that the heroes are associated with the dynasty of Saul. Now, Saul was the king of Israel, back in a little bit before the year 1000 BCE. He was the first king of Israel who had no dynasty, because right after Saul, David takes over and usurps the throne, or it's given to him by the prophet Samuel. There is no dynasty of Saul. There hasn't been a dynasty of Saul in 600 years. But he associates his heroes with the dynasty of Saul. They're from the same tribe. They're from the tribe of Benjamin. They have the introductions are very much the same, and commentators have always noticed that there are allusions to the house of Saul in the story of Esther. So I guess to the extent that I have a contribution here, it's asking, okay, why would there be, though, allusions to the house of Saul in a book 600 years after Saul? Why revive the image of Saul? And the suggestion is that it's not so much that he cares about Saul, because Saul's been long gone, as much as that other people at the time are talking about a resurrection of the Davidic dynasty. Because the house of David is not at all long gone. It's actually still existing, and people are saying, oh, the Davidic dynasty is going to restore the monarchy in Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and so on. And he draws heroes who are, in a sense, sort of the anti-David. And so he says, no, I can't have heroes from David's family. I have to have heroes from, well, who is it that's not David? So it is a monarchy that he's looking back to, but it's from Saul. So there's a whole series of texts that, again, commentators have always pointed out that this alludes to that, and that there are these references. But the political implications are, I think, sort of left to be drawn out. Mm-hmm. So those are two examples.
How many languages were you working in to write this?
Of the primary text, I mean?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I mean, the primary text, meaning the major texts, are basically in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. There's some things that are. I wasn't really sure, as I'm sure is usually the case. As I started the project, I wasn't sure what it was going to look like, so I sort of cast a wide net about everything about Esther. So there's a lot of medieval stuff in the footnotes. It turns out to be this really fantastic literature. I mean, the medieval commentaries are great, but there's a large body of medieval Judeo-Arabic commentaries on Esther, and some of them said some really fantastically insightful things. A lot of this has been published in the last 2 decades or so. A lot of them were Karaites. A lot of the Judeo-Arabic writers were Karaites, and in the 19th century, which I don't know anything about, but you do, there was a Karaite, actually, Abraham Firkovich, who was not French, so you're not responsible. But he was a rich guy who lived in Russia and collected hundreds and hundreds of Karaite manuscripts, and then donated them to the St. Petersburg library at his death. So for much of the 20th century, this stuff was basically off limits to Western researchers, and the last couple of decades has been this fantastic explosion of Karaite and more broadly Judeo-Arabic texts that were in his collection that are now being published, and really fascinating stuff. So there's some Arabic stuff. I don't know any Latin. I don't know where Professor Jaffe is. He left. Okay. But there's some Latin stuff. Luckily, it was, there are translations, and I checked with people to make sure that those were reliable. But that's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, it just struck me as having to really work between a lot of different languages.
Yeah.
But that's, I guess, what Bible scholars do.
Well, in part, that's true. I mean, Dr. Athler could tell you about it. But when I started graduate school, it was like, take 7 years in graduate school because there's just a lot of languages to know, dead languages, and there's no way to do it short. So that's true. But most of them actually didn't play so much of a role here. All that stuff I spent those years in graduate school on didn't help at all. It was very
Because
sad.
most of the scholarship that you were looking at was already in English.
No, because of stuff because in graduate school I was working on the older stuff, so
Oh,
Akkadian
okay.
and Egyptian and that's just before.
What I'm really trying to get at is how many languages do you know? Give us a number.
I really don't. I'm like very happy when I know English. Yeah, nothing else well. I guess.
Okay.
Yes. But look, it's also true that today you can sort of get by in English to a sort of scary degree, so that you can almost fool yourself into thinking you don't need to know that much else, which is
However,
it's actually a problem.
while you're undergrads, you should obviously be
100%. No, there is
pitch for languages here.
100%. Well, it's to a scary degree because it's not true. I mean, you look through the bibliography. So besides the ancient stuff, there's some really valuable modern literature. There's some in languages I'm never going to know, and it's just the facts of life. But French and German are still indispensable, and that's whatever. More and more people publish in English, but there's still really good stuff in those languages, and especially in the humanities. I don't know if you found this in your field, especially in the humanities when it's not necessarily true that the newest stuff is the best stuff. So I found some really wonderfully insightful modern literature from the 20s, 30s, 40s of the 20th century that people have sort of been, going over the same issues, but it was done very well in the early part of the century, and the new stuff is sometimes actually a step backwards. And back then, it wasn't true that everyone was writing in English, so having access to the European languages is still crucial. Definitely true. Time well spent.
Now that we got the language one. So speaking of the humanities, there's something very literary about your scholarship and your in-depth reading of these texts, and you also reference a lot of sort of non-biblical oriented writings. You've got your Marx, and I think there was a Toni Morrison in there, and a few other references like that. So I'm wondering how much sort of your study beyond Bible criticism informs your reading of these texts.
Yeah, definitely. So that's 100%. I mean, I think the best thing that I would hope someone would take away from the book would be, isn't that interesting? These old texts are actually talking about some of the same issues that you can find in a very different form, but it's just a question of form in the most contemporary writers. So, one of the claims, not my claim, but one of the claims that's been made often about Esther is that it's very interested in sort of hybrid identities and cultural diasporas and diaspora literature. So I actually had a very fruitful conversation with Professor Stewart maybe 3-4 years ago when she was first teaching her diaspora literatures class, and took some of the things that she was using. So this is actually exactly the issues that are being talked about, because the issues are the same. You have a people, a culture that was sort of ripped out of its homeland, brought into being a minority in a foreign area where there are lots of other minorities, and trying to work through all these identity issues. So one of the, I think, most challenging issues with not just biblical, but I think all ancient studies is that the way of writing about these issues is just so different. So, if the Book of Esther is really about hybrid identities and sort of diaspora literature, it forgot to tell us that. It just doesn't say it explicitly. Whereas, you open Homi Bhabha, and if you can sort of make your way through his prose, if that's prose, whatever it is. But he's, in a very different genre, actually talking about some of the same issues that I think are actually the author had in mind. And if you could sort of get them to talk to each other, they would say, "Oh, that's exactly what I'm after." But I do it through narrative prose and of a strange variety, and I do it through writing stories that explore characters. So it's true. I mean, I think, look, I'm not like all that erudite, sort of broadly. So, but anything I knew had something to say about some of the issues that were being discussed. So I was very excited to be able to bring that together, and I think it's especially true here that in teaching Bible or anything else in Jewish studies, part of my goal, at least, is that students walk out saying, it's not that I have sort of old texts that I need to know because it's my heritage, and then I have actually the interesting parts of my life which I get to learn about in my humanities classes. But that those old texts are actually very relevant and actually talking about those same issues. But you have to learn how to read them. You have to learn how to sort of decode them or read the narratives as exploring those issues, and that takes a lot of unpacking. So yeah, and that's definitely something I would love for people to walk away with an appreciation for. I'm not sure I'm the best person to do it because I'm not sure that I'm versed enough in sort of the contemporary literature about it. But to the extent that I could, I tried to make that, bring that to the surface and make that explicit that these are the same issues, and it's predictable. I mean, humans were not that different 2,500 years ago. They wrote different languages. They wrote, they dressed differently. They had different cutting tools, but you take someone whose grandparents were able to live in a culture where they spoke their own language, they had their own autonomous polity, and had a belief of themselves as being the center of the world, rip them out of that violently and plant them as a minority culture in a big, scary empire, and people will respond, I mean, not exactly the same way, but how could they respond totally differently? Of course, it's the same set of questions that are being discussed. So I found a lot of... I actually tried to do like a sort of broad reading in diaspora literature, which wasn't all as useful as I had hoped it would be. But it's the sort of timeless sense of the questions is a major issue for me.
So I want to give other people a chance to ask some questions now.
I have a question that comes out of the field of book history, a subject that I work in. I guess this is in the spirit of this dialogue across disciplinary boundaries. One of the themes in the history of the book is that the making of a book is a collaborative process, right? Many people are involved. And in that sense, the ascription of authorship to a single person is always a fiction. It's a fiction that serves multiple functions, as Michel Foucault wrote famously in an essay called Qu'est-ce que l'auteur? I mean, in the modern world, it performs a juridical function. The author is the bearer of copyright. It can perform a penal function. The author is the person you go after if it's a dangerous work. So I guess my question for you is, what function is the fiction of authorship performing in the story you're telling? Does it allow you to talk about intention? Is that what's at stake here?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It allows me to construct a portrait of who would have written this kind of book. Now, I have no idea. Like, first of all, this is something that I try not to get bogged down in, but I have to sort of for the Bible colleagues, I had to spend some time talking about in the book. There actually are at least 3 different ancient versions of the Book of Esther. So it's actually literally true that it's a fiction to talk about the author of the Book of Esther. There's at least 3 different people who put the finishing touches on 3 different versions of it, and it's actually debated which one is the first one. I take the position, but I don't feel very strongly about it, that the Hebrew book, the one that's sort of best known certainly to people in yeshiva, is actually not the earliest version. That there is an earlier, shorter version. It doesn't have the last chapter and a half, and it has a couple of other other differences. I don't feel very strongly about it. It's very hard to, basically you can lay them out in front of you. You have 3 different versions, and it just becomes a guessing game. Like, well, typologically, which would have come out of which one, and so on. So you have to make assumptions. Authors add but don't subtract, or whatever it might be. So I don't have a strong opinion about it, but it's actually very true that there is no single author of the Book of Esther. But for the purposes of what we were discussing earlier, and for sort of narrative, exactly what you said. So I have no way of knowing whether this sort of fictional author, meaning fictional because I made up a name for him, there obviously was an author in some sense. Someone actually wrote an author, right?
Is that obvious?
Well, it's obvious that someone gave us the book, gave his contemporaries the book in the form that we can read it now. So that's why if there's an earlier version, that's obviously important, and that means that he's not working from scratch. But someone, put the last letter in and said, okay, here's this version, even if 98% of it were there earlier. But what I can't do is say at all how representative he was of sort of a cultural movement or a intellectual group. Is he just sort of one iconoclast who has some thoughts? That would be a sort of radical version of what it means to be an author in this case. Or whether it's actually, he's just sort of channeling stories that other people are telling, narratives that other people have constructed, and he's just put it into the form that we can read it in. So it allows me to tell a story about someone and sort of describe, like we were saying, what he would have been reading, what he might be thinking, what makes him upset, what he's concerned about, and things of that sort. What his education might have been like, because the references that Rachel was making to he's alluding to earlier biblical texts. That means he has to know earlier biblical texts, and if he's doing it in sort of textual form, that means potentially he's actually. And he could be a stand-in for the he's in my sentences might have different reference, but he is actually looking at the text and actually copying phrases and things of that sort. But so it allows us to talk about that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's clearly a construct beyond. I think in a way well beyond what Barthes or Foucault were talking about in terms of authorship in general, because this is actually a made-up person who stands in for a whole cultural process. So this is not just a theoretical question of the death of the author. This is I just made up a person. There's no real person that I'm talking about in any biographical sense.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, the strong version of the argument, though, would be that authorship is always a fiction in the sense that the book is the outcome of a collaborative process. The author in the sense that the text has a single creator is a fiction.
Yeah.
Texts never have.
Well, you've written books.
Yeah, it's a collaborative process.
Right.
Well, I think that's your point. That's why I think you feel authorized to give him that name and to have that collective identity, because it's not just that there was one Persian who felt this way, but that it was a point of view that was obviously shared. The story, there's different versions of the story, so that it's not really. I mean, I think that's part of what you're piecing together. That it's likely, it's definitely collaborative. It comes out of a sense of a way people were thinking about things.
Right. No, it is actually a distinctive feature of not unique at all, but distinctive of biblical narratives that they're all anonymous, in the sense that there is no ascription of authorship within the text. There's lots of descriptions of authorship outside the text later, and even contemporaneously. Well, we sometimes know exactly who wrote it, but within the narratives, there's no sort of introduction, conclusion. Says I wrote this, or so authorship is actually an interesting issue when it comes to biblical narratives, and people have sort of pushed that in a strong way. It's intentional that the biblical narratives want to be anonymous, that it wants to sort of be distant from, it wants to be sort of present itself as an objective national narrative. I don't know whether that's right, but it's certainly a true observation that the biblical narratives are actually striking for their not having named authors. So in general, it's true. And again, I think that's actually not just a theoretical argument. In this case, it's it's a real historical argument that there wasn't. I mean, no one that I would think of in particular. It's just a literary tactic to be able to talk about a movement or a perspective, and to put a name on it rather than to sort of either hypothesize about the demographics or to sort of have to talk around it every time I wanted to say something, which just seemed onerous. So put a face on it, and then it's easier.
So I haven't read the book, so I apologize if this
How'd
is
you get in?
addressed in your research, but I was wondering, how did such a controversial book make its way into Tanakh? How was that?
Yeah, so that's
Understanding
actually a
the
really
laws.
good question. I guess the short answer is I don't really know. That's a great question. Part of why I don't know is because we don't know. I'm sure you've all taken this course, but we don't really know how Tanakh came to be the way it is. So it's incredibly frustrating. Because let me actually sharpen your question a little bit. So before rabbinic times, in the times of the Hashmonaim, in the times of the Hasmoneans, there was already a sort of more religiously acceptable version of the Book of Esther that was produced. And we actually do know something about, because there actually is a colophon at the end of it that actually tells us when it was translated into Greek and where, which is more information than we usually have about biblical texts. But this version of Esther, there are 6 big additions to it. So it starts off with the dream of Mordechai, and it ends with the interpretation of the dream of Mordechai. In the middle, there's Esther's prayer and Mordechai's prayer, and there's a lot of other things. God's mentioned 6 times in the text that we have, and then also in the additions. And this is all existing already. So not only does Esther get into the Bible, but it gets in its problematic form, not in its sort of fixed up, less problematic form. So that's it's a really hard question. Again, if we knew when and where someone had sort of signed off on the Bible as we have it and said, okay, this is, then we'd at least know what context to address this in and say, oh, it's these people, what might they have been thinking, what might they have access to, and so on. We don't know, which makes it even more frustrating. I have some speculation, but it's not the strongest part of the book in terms of not that it's bad, but in terms of it's really just speculative. But I think it's interesting, at least sort of heuristically, to think of Esther as sort of the mirror image of the story of Hanukkah and the Hasmoneans. In the sense that the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, also tell a story of being a minority, in this case in the land, but minority in a big empire, right? So here you have the Seleucids who are coming and making religious decrees, and the Maccabees take a very different tack. So they don't say, okay, if that means I have to be in the palace, that means I have to be in the palace. They say you have to fight, and what the author of Esther would have said, well, but you might die. And the Maccabees say, so you might die, but martyrdom is a worthy cause. It's a worthy way of dying. And they, no compromises on the religious practices, no compromises on religious belief, very much temple-centric, Jerusalem-centric. There's some common elements, and those I do try to argue that we can really see a dialogue here. But after the Hasmonean era is over, and this is a little bit too, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but after the Hasmonean era is over, a couple of decades later, you have King Herod. And in his time, the politics of the Jews are totally different. And Herod is very much assimilationist. We're part of a big empire. Whatever compromises we have to make, we make. My speculation is to look at that time period as when Jewish politics might have been looking favorably at a book like Esther. I try to push it a little bit further and say, which Jews would have done this. I think it's the Pharisees. I think it's under Herod, but it's not a very. I don't have hard evidence for it. It's sort of an argument that it has to be before a certain time, it has to be after a certain time, and at this time the politics seem to be amenable to to the Book of Esther and its inclusion in a collection of sacred writings. But that's really as far as I can go. But I agree with you. I mean, I think that's actually a great question. I would like to think that the Book of Esther would be sort of helpful in actually thinking through the bigger question. If we could figure out when the Book of Esther could be canonized, and that might help us think about the canonization process in general. So if we could be sure of something, that might really be helpful. But it's hard to be sure, basically. But it's great. It's a great point. It's a great point. Yeah.
So you present Esther as someone who's like really sort of an anti-mentality to the Hashmonaim, whereas they're willing to give in. But on the other hand, you have Mordechai, who's someone who seems to be almost the cause of the mass extermination of Jews, and he's standing against the empire, like the Holocaust wasn't. So I mean, you have in the Book of Esther, you have this contradictory, maybe mentalities of what Jews were thinking in that time.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So in the Book of Esther, you're totally right. We have two heroes, two protagonists, right? And they're co-protagonists. There's no sort of detangling them and claiming that one is more of a protagonist than the other, and they're really co-protagonists. I think what you say is actually part of that story. Is that politically, the story is not as monolithic as I've been saying until now, because Esther herself is the sort of epitome of assimilation. Mordechai is a more interesting case. He's not the opposite, because until he's challenged at a certain point of his career, it sounds very much like he had acculturated. Right. He seems to work in the Persian bureaucracy. He's a government employee. It sounds like his colleagues don't know that he's Jewish, which doesn't mean anything about his practice. It just means that he didn't make a big deal about it. But, exactly as you say, when he's faced with a certain challenge, then he has to take a stand. He has to he chooses to make a stand. I don't know if he actually had to, but he chooses to. And I think that's us. It's another case where the questions raised by the book and sort of explored by the book are sort of have obvious resonances today. It's very easy to think of cases where people live comfortably with a hybrid identity until there's some challenge to that hybrid identity, which forces them, and I don't mean forces in a strong sense, but forces personally. It forces them because of who they are. To actually say, well, I can't live anymore in this hybrid identity. I have to pick one over the other. The most recent, incredibly dramatic example is all those people who 2 months ago were comfortably Crimean Ukrainian Russians, who all of a sudden actually had to choose what they would be. And they were actually told you have to choose. But I think Mordechai has a sort of similar experience. Right? Until now he's been a Persian Jew, and what's wrong with being a Persian Jew? So I'm a Persian here, I'm a Jew there, and I am what I am. But once Haman comes on the scene, for whatever reason, that not to get into now, but for whatever reason, that sort of forces him, because of whatever is going on inside him, to say, I can no longer be this sort of comfortable hybrid identity. I now have to choose. So am I going to be Persian or am I going to be Jewish? And the book is very clear about it. So he's Jewish, right? So he puts on his, slightly later, he actually puts on his sackcloth, which means he can no longer go into the palace. And the book is very much set up, but the actions are they're meant prosaically. He puts on sackcloth, so he can no longer go into the palace, but also meant metaphorically. So he can no longer be inside because he's thrown in his lot with the outsiders. So there's, I think you're totally right about Mordechai. And the interplay between the two of them is actually really, really fascinating. So Mordechai is throughout the book, from that point on, Mordechai the Jew. Mordechai the Jew, Mordechai the Jew, Mordechai the Jew. Very overtly Jewish. Esther is never called Esther the Jewess or anything like that. She never even gets her Hebrew name back. Right? We're told once that she had a Hebrew name, it never comes back. So she has a much more complicated identity till the end, and she lives happily ever after as the intermarried queen of Persia. So you're right. I mean, if we only focused on the character of Esther, we'd be doing an injustice to the politics of the book. But that's obviously part of the book, because that's at least a legitimate option, and maybe even a necessary one, but certainly a legitimate one. But definitely true.
When I think of the canonization, I think of everything, and then Megillus Esther, the book of Esther, in the sense that everything else is all about faith in God, and God's taking care of us. He's doing miracles for us. He's winning our battles to take over Israel. But when you get to Esther, as you explained, the rabbis could have easily, and the author could have easily written it in a sense that, well, God is really performing all these miracles behind the scenes, because you can easily read into it one way or the other. So, and from what I understood, that's really where it got you thinking, well, why? Why is it written like this? And was there no event earlier? Was there not a need for something like this earlier in the time of Jewish history? What's unique to this time period in Jewish history? Which sort of got me thinking that right before this point, from what I understand from the classical Jewish history that I've learned so far, is that the Jews had an opportunity to go back to Israel. It was either the end of Babylonian or the beginning of Persian rule that would allow them to go back, but only 40,000 was Zerubbabel and those people that went back, but there was a very few amount that went back. And sort of now that you have this optional exile that the Jews chose, so could one perhaps theorize that, well, now there's a need for it because now Jews are willingly living and staying in the diaspora. They're no longer going back, so now that's not enough to just, live in Israel where God's performing all these miracles for you, but now you really got to start doing stuff for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's not just that it was optional. I think it's just the reality. The author is saying, look, I look back at the biblical texts, and I don't see anything that speaks to my world. I see prophets, and I see miracles, and I see an Exodus. A lot of people at that time were talking about a second Exodus. In other words, waiting for God to bring them out of exile, march them back to Jerusalem, and our fictional author says, "This is all wonderful. I hope it happens, but in the meantime, it's not my life. Not only am I not seeing an Exodus, I don't see God, I don't see prophets, I don't see miracles, but that doesn't mean that Jewish history has ended." So I think you're exactly right, tries to articulate what it means to live as a diaspora Jew, which is, I think precisely as you said, very different from the models he's finding earlier in the Bible. So, that's one type of Jewish experience, but we need a different model for diaspora living. It's really stark when you think about it that the great salvation that the Jews experience in the Book of Esther is basically that they didn't die and they get to live another day. That's all that happens. Nothing has changed, at least not beyond this current generation. So right now we have a Jewish queen, a Jewish vizier. But they're going to die. How long could this possibly last? And then we're given no reason to think that this isn't just going to repeat itself over and over and over again. But this is life in the diaspora. It's not a grand redemption. It's life, which means it's a constant navigation and constant struggle to survive and maybe even thrive. But he's not looking for a sort of world-changing religious experience. He's looking for sort of more realistic picture of what it means to live as a minority in diaspora. But if I can, I'll just use your question to sort of say one thing about something we haven't talked about at all, which is the rabbinic reading of Esther, which very much does try to situate Esther back into a sort of grand narrative of the biblical story, and does try to argue that actually Esther paved the way for a grand redemption, and sometimes does that very explicitly, and sometimes does it in much more subtle ways that actually took me a long time to figure out what they were doing. But just try to say, no, it's not true that you sort of have the grand biblical narrative and then Esther sitting off on the side, but that Esther is actually an integral part of that narrative, and that Esther was necessary to get to the redemption. There's a whole bunch of details, like chronological details and other issues involved there, but I think what you're saying, that sense of sort of Esther sort of being on its own, troubled the rabbis of the Talmud also. And they actually explicitly say that Esther herself petitioned to be included in the canon, and they said, to paraphrase, they said, well, unless you can find us biblical precedent for your story being included, we can't include you. Which is such a sophisticated way of saying, it seems to us that you're very different from the rest of the Bible. So unless you can show us how you fit into the Bible, no, you can't be in the Bible. This doesn't, I don't think historically reflects the canonization process, but does show how the rabbis were we're troubled by exactly what you're saying. That like Esther just seems to be off on its own, and unless we can situate it within the grand biblical narrative, it has no place there. So they worked hard to do that. I think they did it actually in remarkable ways, reading it, in all sorts of very, very sophisticated and really intelligent, perceptive ways, in order to do that. I think that wasn't what the author was trying to do, but it is how it got spun into part of the story.
Daniel, and then
Would you say that your theory comes more out of the historical evidence and perspective, or maybe more out of the literary perspective? And how do you integrate the two in your analysis?
That's interesting. So I said to a colleague who is an intellectual historian who said, "Oh, it seems like intellectual history. I'm gonna read this." And I said, "Well, it is intellectual history, but it's intellectual history sort of by way of philology, because all we have is these texts. I mean, that's what we have. So in order to construct anything of an intellectual history, we have to work with the texts in order to say something like, well, based on these texts, then we can sort of construct a picture of what people were saying, what people were thinking." So there's no I don't think there's any separation here between the literary and the historical, at least when it comes to intellectual history. I don't do anything with political, except in the background, political or cultural or social history. But one of the things that I think was actually, I don't know what to say about this. I hope that other people will read what I'm about to say, will see in my book and say like, oh, that's actually very interesting. I've noticed other examples of it. I have this tactic that I claim that ancient authors used, but I only have like sort of a handful of examples. I can't remember what I called it exactly. An elusive keyword or a keyword illusion? Elusive keyword, I think. Elusive with an A. The claim that I make is that sometimes an author would want you to be thinking of some other text in order to better understand his text. But in order to do that, instead of like having footnotes or something, he would include a phrase or two phrases which, to the sort of informed reader, would have to remind you of that other text. And then, and here's the sort of speculative claim, once you have that other text in mind, hopefully you'll get a whole other series of references in this later text also. The key word is sort of supposed to tip you off that that's an important intertext. Think about that as you read the rest of the story. So I actually had a lot more examples than I thought. I mean, I don't remember 4 or 5 examples that I think that Esther alludes to other texts and other texts allude to Esther. But that's sort of very much in the classical literary approach. The claim is that allows you to then, since it's an allusion that's meant to bring up a whole set of other questions, that then allows you to think about the sort of intellectual, cultural history questions that are involved. So, this text is alluding to that text, but it's not just to show how smart he is. It's because he wants you to reflect on the politics of that text and how that's different from the politics of this text, or something like that. So there's a few examples of things like that. But I think, to answer your question, I don't think there's any way to detangle them. I think for ancient history in general, all we have is texts. So I actually had this idea of writing this book that was going to be totally accessible to all humanists, and there was going to be nothing technical, and you wouldn't have to know anything. So there's actually nothing, everything's in translation. But still, I mean, it's just, there's no way of getting around the sort of detailed reading of the text and picking on phrases and trying to claim that, this phrase is an allusion to that, which means I have to really think about how exactly is it phrased here. There was one important point that I think charts, yeah. One important point that I think emerged from sort of one of the Greek additions to the Book of Esther, retrojecting to what it must have been in Hebrew, and then thinking about what that Hebrew might have been alluding to in other biblical texts. So there's a lot of sort of philology that's I think unavoidable, but hopefully in this, I think in the service of broader ideas, but it's still very literary and textual.
You don't have to apologize for that.
Yeah, no, I'm not apologizing. I think it's, yeah, maybe I am apologizing. I shouldn't be apologizing. You're right. I don't know, because I would like it to rise. I would like it to be accessible, because I think the ideas issue that story could be told, even for someone who has no interest in the literary issues, no interest in sort of a close reading of ancient texts and a philological approach to them. There are broad issues, and I guess in my sort of hypothetical dreamland, I wish that cultural historians would be able to look at this and say, like, oh, isn't that interesting? We can see connections here and there. It's going to be very hard because they'd have to slog through the textual work in order to get those ideas. So I'm sort of apologizing to myself, but
Well, you
whatever.
stop
It is what it is.
at rabbinics, but
Yeah.
if you were to continue up to the present day, which you could, then
Yeah.
it would get increasingly
That's interesting.
less philological.
Right.
Right.
That's probably true. Although, right. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting things. There's for the Moranos, for the crypto Jews, Saint Esther was a patron saint, which sort of makes intuitive sense as soon as you say that. But that's a really fascinating cultural moment. And then there's been all sorts of interesting writing about the connection between Purim and violence, because there's a sort of ugly part of the book, which we don't like to talk about too much, where the Jews, at least on one reading, sort of gratuitously massacre thousands of Persians. On the other reading, it's not gratuitous; they still massacre them. But so there's all sorts of cultural echoes and significances that the book took on once you get past the rabbinic period. And Dr. Fine actually said when he first saw my outline, he was like, "Why aren't you doing the early Christian stuff?" So there's
volume
like
2 will be in modern Jewish thought.
Yeah.
And beyond.
maybe. I assume you mean someone else. The collaborative process is going to take off, and someone else is going to be writing that part.
Right.
Aaron, obviously Esther became something of the Western iconography. You cannot walk into a museum in
Right.
the Western world without seeing, 17th, 18th century, 19th century, the pictures. So that's interesting. I mean,
It is
perhaps
interesting.
to a bigger extent than other biblical texts. Or I don't know.
So I'm told, I don't really know this well, I'm told by Sharon Mintz, who works at the Jewish Museum.
Jewish Theological Seminary.
She works at the Jewish Theological Seminary. She's an art historian or something like that, a curator. Anyway, so she was commenting on the cover, which is actually a painting that I picked. Not that I know so much about art. I knew one painting about Esther, so I said, how about this painting? And they were like, cool. No, I knew a little bit more than one, but I actually liked it a lot because it's very non-sexualized about Esther.
Right.
It's it's the impression I get is much more about the political intrigue, which was I think what I wanted to be on the cover. But it's from Rembrandt's time, not Rembrandt, and so Sharon Mintz tells me that for the Dutch, Esther was a major story because they had sort of recently thrown off Spanish political hegemony, and they were working through these issues of also when you can assert your own identity as opposed to the sort of overlord's identity, and that Esther played a big role in their own thinking. So I don't know anything about it, but it sounds like it's very rich for whoever's writing volume 2 to go with that.
Esther looks a lot more European than Achashverosh. It's very interesting.
Then Achashverosh, that's interesting. In terms of the dress or in terms of the
Appearance.
facial features? She's definitely paler. Yeah, I don't know.
They're eating challah. It's very
They're
convenient.
inclined.
Yes.
Okay, so I once heard this idea, and I wonder if it can be, not sure, if it could be true that the father of Xerxes was the same ruler who was tricked into giving this decree that everyone should be bowing down to him, and this is the decree that Daniel he refused to bow, and he was thrown to the furnace, and upon seeing that, and upon realizing after he emerged, the king sees that he was duped, and he kills the advisors that gave him this idea, and so maybe this could be an answer to why the Jews of Persia were, doing this massacre was because, they were allowed to because the king allowed them to. And the reason why Xerxes would allow him to do this is because in his situation, Haman had just sort of tricked him into putting out this decree to kill all the Jews, and he is now reflecting on the same situation that his father was in. That similarly he was also duped into, performing this decree. Maybe this new decree by Xerxes, by allowing the Jews to do this massacre, was maybe this kind of response, or this way of killing two birds with one stone. He gives the Jews, he gives them what they want, and he also gets this kind of revenge on Haman for kind of tricking him into making him lose all this money because he wanted to kill the Jews.
Interesting. Well, I guess just on the factual level, it's true. I mean, Darius is the king in the story of Daniel, and that's Xerxes' predecessor. I don't know how to psychologize Xerxes within the story, and claim what his motivation would be, other than what the story itself tells, which doesn't give a lot of psychological credit to the king. I mean, he basically does anything. I think he actually literally does everything everyone tells him to do. Anytime anyone comes to him with an idea and a suggestion, he says good. So when you say he tricked him into killing the Jews, you didn't really trick him. He said, "Can I kill the people?" And he said, "Sure." That's all he did. So I don't know how to confirm or deny the sort of intergenerational speculation. The only thing I'd say is that the Book of Esther seems to be very almost laser focused on not talking about the past or the future. It makes no mention of how anyone got to where they are, how Xerxes got to be king, how the Jews got to diaspora, other than mentioning that Mordechai's great-grandfather was exiled. And that's very different from, let's say, the book of Daniel, which actually opens, in order to tell the story of diaspora Jews, it says, once upon a time there was a king Nebuchadnezzar who conquered Jerusalem and he exiled the Jews, and now they're in exile, and here, let me tell you about 4 of them. The book of Esther, starts where it starts. It was in the days of Xerxes. It ends where it ends. Does Esther have children? There's no looking to the future. There's no looking to the past, no looking to the future. It seems to really be focused on the present. So that's not to confirm or deny what you say. I'd say that seems to actually be sort of the kind of thing that the author doesn't want to talk about. It's not to say it's not true. It's just to say that the author wants to stay focused on this decade and the events in this decade, and not try to situate them in a broader history, which I think is actually really fascinating. Of course, it goes back to what you said, to give it sort of meaning in the context of Jewish history, many later readers wanted to do exactly that and say, no, we have to situate it in the context of a broader narrative. Otherwise, it's a little standalone story that doesn't fit into the big story. So they needed to do that, but the author seems to actually want to not talk about the past or the future. So, I don't know what to say about the specific suggestion, but I think that the author might just be annoyed to hear the question.
Marduka.
Right.
One
You don't want to
last
incur the
question.
wrath of Marduka.
Will.
So I'm interested in, I guess, the relationship between what you're saying about diasporas, where you're willing to make a generalization that people across vast spans of history are facing essentially the same issues. That kind of claim always makes me incredibly nervous and suspicious anyway, so of course I got nervous and suspicious about it. And it does seem to me to tie in some ways with the way that you want the book to be accessible. That is, you're sort of sending messages out to the reader of, here's a place that you can hook onto and relate to in some way. But it does seem to me that diasporas are different. At the minimum, you would really want to distinguish between a diaspora where minorities are given the opportunity to be themselves without being interfered with, and of course there's a little bit of a mess up in that if a king proposes. So it sort of brings the two cultures into contact in a way that they wouldn't ordinarily be, and the kind of diaspora where there are decrees and people have to hide and, step 4 steps back from the window and so on. But it seems to me much more than that. It seems to me that you could really make a claim that all diasporas are different, which would put you in the position of making much more careful analogies and doing a sort of little compare and contrast, what's the same, what's different, and so forth in each case, which I think you don't want to do. I assume that historically you'd be willing to accept that all diasporas are different. But then how do you address the relationship of that or the tension of that with the desire for accessibility and the desire to generalize?
Yeah, that's a good point. So, first of all, when I said I tried to read in diaspora literature, I did, my reading in diaspora literature and decided it wasn't as useful as I was hoping. So that's actually one of the major reasons, is that, there were very few, I would say, like, universals of diaspora literature that would be actually useful. If you're willing to abstract and generalize enough, of course, you can come up with some universals, and that's to remain on the very abstract, on a very general level, to talk about a hybrid identity, to talk about balancing between loyalties to one's heritage and one's current location. That's a very vague statement. What loyalties means, what it means to balance them, and so on. And to that extent, I can't say 100%, but that's certainly a common feature of diasporas. In the book, I actually make no attempt to compare it to any other diaspora ever. All I try to do is to draw on, mostly in footnotes actually, but to draw on literatures and writers who experienced diaspora in other ways or reflected on diasporas in other ways, where it seemed to be comparable in this or that detail. But I don't try to... You're
looking for the close analogy.
I'm looking for close analogies, but only on point by point. Right. So there's this particular point, that has an interesting analog here. But I certainly don't try to construct a broad theory of diaspora. What I meant by accessible was actually the opposite, I think. Although, again, I've sort of gave up at a stage in the process on it being really accessible easily. But what I meant was actually, I think, the opposite. In other words, can we add this to the database of different diaspora experiences and how different diasporas responded literarily to the experience of being in a challenging cultural environment for the following reasons. So not to claim that here is a template or a lens through which we can now see all diasporas, but hey, there are lots of people who are thinking about what diaspora literature means and what kind of literature is produced in diaspora. Can you add this to the mix as another kind of experience where we actually have a decent amount of literature, certainly for the ancient world. You have 3 or 4 books produced in the same century. That's a lot. Within 500 miles. So could we get people who know more about sort of a broad sweep of diaspora literature and diaspora theory to look over here and to say, that's interesting. When I talk about different kinds of diasporas, and when I want to talk about how different diasporas are different, this might be another example which has some points of similarity but some points of contrast. But yeah, I certainly didn't mean to. When I said that the humans all have the same experience, I meant the same basic, again, very general challenge. But certainly not that they have the same experience in terms of the details of that challenge, what the challenge is, or how much more so how they navigate that challenge. So that's certainly true.
And do you address the ways in which Esther might be extremely atypical? That is, in the sense that she can't really stand in for the experience of Jews in general in that cultural situation because of the unique characteristics of the situation she finds herself in.
Meaning she as a character or the book?
Yeah, as a character and facing particular challenges as opposed to the challenge of just being in a diaspora in general. Right.
So yeah, I think that the author chose a sort of most extreme case to highlight and dramatize what all Jews could experience in different ways. So obviously, most Jews are not being asked to marry the king, and if there's any tension in the book, there's very little tension in the book as to the sort of typical narrative tension. But if there's any tension in the book, it's actually personified in Esther when she has to decide, am I loyal to Mordechai and the Jews, or am I loyal to the king and the Persians? So that's, so she sort of personifies in a very, very explicit way what the major issues that the author wants to claim many Jews might actually be experiencing in far less extreme ways. I mean, most Jews, as you say, are not going to be in the experience of having to choose between the person who brought them up and the person to whom they're married. But many Jews will be in the experience of having to choose between loyalty to their Jewish traditions in some sense, whatever that might mean, and loyalty to the Persian Empire in some sense, whatever that might mean. Whether it means, my bureaucratic job means working on Saturday, or I'm being asked to go to the king's banquet in chapter 1 and the food might not be kosher, which some readers made a very big deal about, that there's no special food in chapter 1 for the Jews. So suggesting that the Jews acculturated and were willing to actually eat the Persian food, so to speak. But I think Esther is actually not meant to be sui generis, that she's alone, but on the contrary, she's an extreme case of what many Jews might actually experience in a much more toned down version.
Okay, one last student question.
So I just wanted to ask you about something that to me seems a little incongruous, because on one hand you have Chazal, okay, so they included this in the biblical canon, and if the message truly is that they are sanctioning the idea to violate laws in order to keep on living, then there are other statements that that Chazal say, like, that you're not even, like, forget about intermarriage. I'm saying, like, you're not even allowed to tie your shoes the same way, like that's a statement in the Talmud, I believe, that you're not even allowed to tie your shoes the same way that the ruling class tied their shoes. So I wanted to just ask you what you thought about that.
Right. So 2 points. One is that the rabbis in the Talmud actually work hard to argue that Esther is not nearly as radical as I was speculating before that the book might have tried to be. And that Esther actually did keep Shabbat and did keep Nidah, which is actually not far-fetched, because Xerxes was Zoroastrian and they kept Nidah even more strictly than Jews did. But Kashrut and so on, and that all these things Esther did do. So for the rabbis, it's not at all clear that Esther is a model of someone who sacrificed her religiosity for the government, so to speak. But on that same page where they talk about the shoelaces, it also asks about Esther. It says, how come Esther didn't have to give up her life rather than intermarry? And there's two different answers. But one of the answers, which is I think what turns out for Talmudic thought to be a really important legal principle, is that, well, it depends on why the king wanted her to intermarry. If the point was to try to eradicate the Jewish religion, and so this is a decree against the Jews, all Jews must intermarry, then yeah, even if it's a shoelace, whatever that meant exactly, if it's red or black shoelaces or something, and you say you can't use the Jewish shoelaces anymore, then you have to give up your life rather than give that up, because the whole point is to eradicate the Jewish religion, and you can't let that happen. But if it was just because he fell in love with a Jewish girl, and now do I have to give up my life rather than whatever? Does she have to give up her life rather than marry the non-Jewish king? He just loves her, wants to marry her. He couldn't care less if she's Jewish or not Jewish. His intention is not at all to eradicate the Jewish religion. He just wants to marry this girl, and she happens to be Jewish. Then the Talmud says, and she doesn't have to give up her life. She's actually allowed to intermarry, because this is not one of the 3 cardinal sins, and there's no nefarious intention here on the part of the king. He's not trying to erase the Jewish religion. He's just trying to marry the girl of his dreams. I think the Talmud actually, very interested in Esther as that, presenting that sort of border challenge. Like, when do you have to stand up and for your principles, even at the cost of your life, and when can you say, look, I mean, the Jewish religion is not at stake here. It's just my particular practice, And for my particular practice, so I give it up now for the sake of a greater good. Maybe that's allowed sometimes. But as you know, the vast majority of the time, Talmud says you don't have to give up your life. It's only.
But what if you're one of those people who's of the schools of thought? I remember learning this there's a whole back and forth about who Esther exactly is. Is she the daughter of Mordechai? Is she the wife of Mordechai? I don't know how much experience you have in terms of studying that, but if you are of the school of thought that she's the wife of Mordechai, you absolutely are. She's doing one of the
right.
sins. So
that is a claim in the Talmud. We can talk about it later, but it's a very strange claim that's made. I think they're actually trying to say something really important about the book, but I think it would be a mistake to even take it at face value within rabbinic thought. I don't think the rabbis at all were trying to say that she was actually married to Mordechai. It makes the story actually fall apart. The virgins were brought to the palace. It's a very strange marriage.
That's okay. So I think we're going to wrap it up there, but you're welcome to come and speak to Professor Koller afterwards and check out the book. And I want to thank Professor Quillich for sharing the Honors Lounge with us, this great space, and thank you all for coming.
We thank Dr. Mash also. Thank you.